The crack of splintering wood echoed through Fort Davis as Penelope Zimmerman slammed the cavalry sergeant's knuckles against the rough pine table, her calloused hand still gripping his in an iron hold as 30 men erupted into shocked bellows and catcalls. She had not meant to cause such a spectacle when she had ridden into the military outpost that scorching August afternoon in 1878, her wagon laden with barrels of preserved peaches and dried venison she had hoped to sell to the quartermaster. The fort sat on the western edge of Texas, a collection of limestone buildings and adobe barracks that housed soldiers tasked with protecting settlers and mail routes from Apache raids that still plagued the region despite years of conflict. Penelope had made this journey twice before, from her small ranch outside Marfa, a town barely worthy of the name with its scattered buildings and water stop along the new railroad line. At 22 years old, she had been running her late father's property for 3 years now, ever since fever had taken both her parents during the brutal winter of 1875. The sergeant whose hand she had just defeated was a bull-necked man named Crawford, perhaps 30 years old, with a thick mustache and the kind of swagger that came from too many whiskeys and too few challenges. He had intercepted her at the quartermaster's office, making crude remarks about her height, her broad shoulders, her unfeminine strength as she hefted the barrels down from her wagon bed without assistance. When she had ignored him, he had grown bolder, suggesting that perhaps she was not a woman at all beneath those dusty trousers and work shirt. That was when she had turned to face him directly, her green eyes meeting his bloodshot gaze without flinching. "I am every bit a woman," she had said quietly, "and likely stronger than you, besides." Crawford had laughed, a harsh braying sound that drew the attention of nearby soldiers. "Stronger than me? Girl, I can bench press a full-grown bull. Then you should have no trouble with a simple arm wrestling match," Penelope had replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She had never been one to back down from confrontation, a trait her father had encouraged even as it made her mother worry. In this harsh land, weakness invited exploitation, and Penelope had learned early that she could not afford to show vulnerability. Within minutes, word had spread through the fort like wildfire. Men poured out of barracks, the mess hall, the stables, forming a loose circle in the shade of the commissary building where someone had dragged out a table. Money changed hands as bets were placed, most of it on Crawford, though a few soldiers who had seen Penelope unload her wagon put coins on her instead. The odds were not favorable, 5-1 against her, but she had not entered this contest for profit. They had positioned themselves across from each other, elbows planted on the scarred wood, fingers interlocked. Crawford's hand was meaty and damp with sweat. Penelope's was leaner but no less powerful, the muscles in her forearms standing out like corded rope beneath sun-bronzed skin. Her blonde hair, usually tied back in a practical braid, had come loose in wisps around her face, and she had blown them away impatiently as the referee, a grizzled corporal, called for them to begin. The first 30 seconds had been a stalemate, both of them straining against the other's resistance, their joined hands trembling in mid-air. Penelope had felt the burn in her shoulder, her bicep, her wrist, but she had held firm, thinking of all the fence posts she had driven into hard clay soil, all the water buckets she had hauled from the well, all the struggling calves she had pulled during difficult births. Crawford's face had turned crimson, veins bulging at his temples, and she had seen the moment when confidence shifted to doubt in his eyes. She had struck then, putting everything she had into one sustained push, forcing his hand backward inch by agonizing inch until his knuckle struck wood with a sound like a gunshot. The crowd had exploded into chaos, winners crowing their good fortune, losers cursing and demanding a rematch, and Penelope had stood on shaking legs, her arms still vibrating from the exertion. Crawford had lurched upright, his chair toppling backward, fury and humiliation warring across his features. "You cheated," he had snarled, stabbing a thick finger toward her chest. "No woman can beat me fair and square." Before Penelope could respond, a new voice cut through the din, deep and resonant as distant thunder. "She beat you fair, and every man here saw it." The crowd had parted, and Penelope found herself looking at a man who seemed carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they blocked the sun, casting her in shadow. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, held back from his face by a strip of leather tied around his forehead. His beard was full but neatly trimmed, framing a mouth set in a firm line above a jaw that could have been chiseled from granite. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple homespun shirt that strained across a chest thick with muscle, and at his hip hung a hunting knife with a handle made from antler. His eyes, she noted with a strange flutter in her chest, were the color of whiskey held up to lamplight, amber shot through with gold. Crawford had taken one look at this newcomer and seemed to deflate slightly, his bluster evaporating. "Jensen," he muttered, "this does not concern you." "It concerns me when you call a lady a cheater without cause," the mountain man replied evenly. His gaze shifted to Penelope, and she felt the weight of it like a physical touch. "Begging your pardon, miss, but I witnessed the entire contest. You won through strength and skill, nothing more." Penelope had lifted her chin, unused to being defended but strangely not offended by it. "Thank you, but I can speak for myself." One corner of the mountain man's mouth had quirked upward, not quite a smile but close. "I do not doubt it," still seemed worth saying. Crawford had muttered something obscene and pushed his way through the crowd, several of his friends following. The remaining soldiers had dispersed gradually, the excitement over returning to their duties or their leisure as the afternoon heat intensified. Penelope had found herself alone with the mountain man, the sounds of the fort resuming around them, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the snort of horses in the corrals, the distant bark of a drill sergeant putting men through their paces. "I am Hawkins Jensen," he said, extending his hand. "Most just call me Hawk." She had taken his hand, noting the calluses that matched her own, the careful control in his grip, despite the obvious power behind it. "Penelope Zimmerman. Most just call me Penelope." His eyes had crinkled at that, a genuine smile breaking through. "Fair enough. You travel far to make that supply delivery." "From Marfa." "About 25 miles southeast alone?" It was not quite an accusation, but she bristled anyway. "I have been making this trip for 2 years without incident." "No criticism intended," Hawk said, raising his hands peacefully. "This is dangerous country is all. Apaches and bandits and worse. It takes a certain kind of courage to ride it alone." Penelope had softened slightly, recognizing genuine concern rather than condescension. "Or a certain kind of necessity. I have no hired hands and the work does not wait for convenient companions. You run your ranch yourself." "I do now. My father started it, but he passed 3 years back. My mother went with him." Something in Hawk's expression shifted, a shadow of old pain that spoke of his own losses. "That is a hard road to walk, I am sorry." They had stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Hawk cleared his throat. "I was about to head into town for supper. The fort has decent enough grub, but there is a boarding house in Marfa that makes the best steak and potatoes this side of San Antonio. Would you permit me to buy you a meal? Seems the least I can do for the entertainment of watching you humble Sergeant Crawford." Penelope had hesitated, weighing propriety against the growling of her stomach and the undeniable curiosity she felt toward this quiet-spoken giant. "I should be getting back before dark. Sun will not set for another 4 hours, Hawk had pointed out reasonably. "Plenty of time to eat and still make Marfa by dusk. Besides, I would feel better knowing you had an escort for the ride, at least partway." There was something in his eyes that decided her, a warmth beneath the formal courtesy that suggested loneliness recognized and kindred. "All right," she had agreed. "But I pay my own way." "You won that arm wrestling match," Hawk had countered. "Which means you took money off every man who bet on you, and you defended your honor besides. Let me buy you supper as congratulations." In the end she had relented, and they had made the journey back to Marfa together, Penelope in her wagon and Hawk on a massive dappled gray gelding that looked strong enough to carry him and full-grown elk besides. They had talked little on the ride, but the silence had been comfortable rather than strained, and Penelope had found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking, taking in the easy way he sat his saddle, the constant awareness in how his eyes scanned the landscape, the competence that radiated from every movement. The boarding house Hawk had mentioned was run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, a round-faced woman in her 50s who greeted Hawk with obvious affection and barely concealed curiosity when she saw Penelope with him. The dining room was simple but clean, with gingham curtains and oil lamps already lit against the gathering dusk. Only 2 other tables were occupied, one by a pair of railroad surveyors bent over maps, the other by an elderly gentleman reading a week-old newspaper from Austin. They had taken a table by the window, and Mrs. Fletcher had brought them coffee without being asked, strong and hot and bitter in a way that Penelope appreciated after the long, dusty ride. When the steak arrived, thick and seared to perfection with mashed potatoes, swimming in gravy and green beans cooked with bacon, Penelope had not bothered hiding her appreciation, eating with the appetite of someone who worked hard for her living. You were not exaggerating about the quality of the food here, she said after the first few bites. Hawk had nodded, cutting his own steak with precision. Mrs. Fletcher is a treasure. I try to stop here whenever I come through Marfa, which is how often. Every few weeks, depending on my trapping routes. I work the mountains north of here, sell my furs in El Paso and sometimes as far as Santa Fe, but I like to check in at Fort Davis, see if they have any scouting work or need someone to guide supply trains. You were a scout in the army, Penelope had asked, intrigued despite herself, for a time, during the worst of the Apache campaigns back in 72 through 75. But I am not much for taking orders long term, and the mountains call to me something fierce. So I went back to trapping and hunting, living on my own terms. Penelope had understood that sentiment completely. I know something about preferring independence. After my parents died, I had 3 different men from town offer to buy my ranch, always phrased as helping me, as if I was incapable of managing it myself. But you have managed it, Hawk said, and it was not a question. I have, not without struggle, but yes. I have kept it running, even expanded the herd a bit last year. It is not much, but it is mine, and I will be damned if I let someone take it from me out of some misguided notion that I am too delicate for the work. Hawk had studied her across the table, his amber eyes thoughtful. I do not think anyone who saw you beat Crawford today would call you delicate. Penelope had laughed at that, a real laugh that surprised her with its freedom. Crawford certainly will not. I likely made an enemy there. Crawford makes enemies easily enough on his own, Hawk said dismissively. He is a bully and a drunk, and most of the men at the fort tolerate him at best. You just wounded his pride, which was overgrown anyway. He will bluster for a while, and then find someone else to torment. They had continued talking as the meal progressed, the conversation flowing easier than Penelope would have expected given they had just met. Hawk told her about his childhood in Missouri, how he had come west after his parents died of cholera, when he was barely 16, how he had learned to survive in the wilderness through a combination of desperation, observation, and help from an old French trapper who had taken pity on him. Penelope shared her own story, the daughter of a dreamer who had believed the West offered opportunity for those brave enough to seize it, how she had learned ranching at her father's side because he had no sons, and refused to treat her as less capable because of her gender. By the time Mrs. Fletcher cleared their plates and brought out apple pie still warm from the oven, Penelope realized the sun had set completely, the window beside them now black and reflecting the lamplight. She should have been worried about the late hour, about the impropriety of dining alone with a man she barely knew, about the ride back to her ranch in full darkness. Instead, she felt an unusual contentment, a sense of rightness that she could not quite explain. I should get back, she said reluctantly as they finished the last of the coffee. My livestock will need tending come morning, and I am burning daylight I do not have. It is full dark now, Hawk pointed out, his brow furrowing. The road to your ranch, is it well traveled? Well enough, and I know every rock and rut by heart. Nevertheless, Hawk pushed back from the table, rising to his full imposing height. I will ride with you. Make sure you get home safe. Penelope wanted to argue, to insist she needed no protection, but something in his expression stopped her. This was not about doubting her capability. This was about a man who had lost people he cared about, who lived in a land where danger was real and constant, who would not sleep easy knowing he had let a woman ride alone into the night when he could have prevented it. All right, she said softly, and thank you. They had ridden out together under a sky brilliant with stars, the Milky Way a river of light overhead, the moon not yet risen. The temperature had dropped with the sun setting, the desert air cooling rapidly, and Penelope was grateful for the jacket she had stowed in the wagon. Hawk rode beside her, his horse matching pace with her mule's, and though they spoke little, his presence was a comfort she had not known she needed. Her ranch, when they reached it after an hour's travel, was a modest affair. A small house built from adobe with a wooden porch her father had added, a barn that housed her milk cow and her riding horse, a chicken coop, and corrals that held her dozen head of cattle. It was not much, but in the starlight it looked almost beautiful, and Penelope felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had sustained her through the hardest times. Hawk helped her unhitch the mules and settle them for the night without being asked, moving with practiced efficiency. When the animals were fed and watered, he walked her to the porch of her house, his boots loud on the wooden steps. Thank you for supper, Penelope said, turning to face him, and for the company. I confess I usually eat alone, and it was pleasant to have someone to talk to. "The pleasure was entirely mine," Hawk replied, and the way he looked at her in the starlight made her breath catch. "Penelope, I realize this is forward of me, but would you permit me to call on you? I will be in the area for the next few weeks at least, and I would very much like to see you again." Her heart had hammered against her ribs, a wild, excited thing. She had received offers of courtship before, from ranch hands and shopkeepers and even a circuit preacher, but none of them had stirred anything in her beyond mild annoyance at the interruption to her work. This was different. Hawk was different. He saw her strength as an asset rather than an aberration, met her as an equal, and something in his presence, called to something in her that she had not known, was waiting. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I would like that very much." The smile that broke across his face transformed him, softening the hard edges, revealing the warmth beneath. "Then I will return in 3 days if that suits you. Perhaps you could show me your ranch properly, and we could have a picnic if the weather holds." 3 days, Penelope agreed, already counting the hours. Hawk had tipped his hat to her then, a gesture both old-fashioned and charming, and swung himself onto his horse with fluid grace. She watched him ride away until the darkness swallowed him completely, then stood on her porch for long minutes after, staring up at the stars and wondering what she had set in motion. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of anticipation and routine. Penelope threw herself into her work with even more intensity than usual, cleaning the house until it gleamed, mending the split rail fence along the north pasture, culling the weakest chickens for the stew pot, and preserving the meat. She told herself she was simply being productive, taking advantage of the cooler September weather that had begun to settle in, but she knew the truth. She was nervous in a way she had never been before, uncertain and excited in equal measure. On the morning of the 3rd day she rose before dawn and bathed in the copper tub she dragged into the kitchen, heating water on her stove until steam rose in clouds. She washed her hair with the lavender soap she saved for special occasions, combed out the tangles and braided it carefully. Her wardrobe was limited, mostly work clothes, but she had one dress that her mother had made for her before she died, a simple design in dark blue calico with mother-of-pearl buttons. She put it on, feeling strange and almost vulnerable without the armor of her usual trousers and boots, but when she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked young and almost pretty, her eyes bright with anticipation, her cheeks flushed. Hawk arrived exactly when he had promised, riding up to her house with saddlebags that she suspected held their picnic lunch. He dismounted in one smooth motion, and she watched from the doorway as he tied his horse to the porch rail and turned to face her. The expression on his face when he saw her in the dress made all her nervous preparation worthwhile. He went very still, his eyes widening slightly, and when he spoke his voice was rougher than usual. "Penelope, you look beautiful." She felt heat rise in her face but met his gaze steadily. "Thank you. You look quite presentable yourself." He had cleaned up as well, she noticed, his hair still damp and slicked back, his beard freshly trimmed, wearing what must have been his best shirt, dark red with simple bone buttons. He looked less like a wild mountain man and more like a gentleman caller, though the knife at his belt and the rifle in his saddle scabbard reminded her that this was still a dangerous land where even social visits required precautions. They spent the morning walking her property, Penelope pointing out the improvements she had made, the challenges she still faced. Hawk listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions, offering suggestions born from his own experience surviving in harsh conditions. He admired her irrigation system, helped her repair a section of the barn roof that had been damaged in a recent windstorm, and won the trust of her skittish milk cow through patience and a gentle touch. For lunch they rode out to a spot Penelope loved, a small canyon about a mile from her house where a spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwood trees. It was an oasis in the harsh landscape, and Penelope had spent many evenings here over the past 3 years, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the place. Hawk spread a blanket in the shade, and they unpacked the food he had brought: cold fried chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of honey. They ate slowly, talking and laughing, and Penelope found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Her fears about failing, her loneliness, her determination to prove that she could survive on her own terms. "You already have proved it," Hawk said quietly, lying back on the blanket with his hands behind his head, staring up through the cottonwood leaves at the blue sky beyond. 3 years alone, keeping a ranch running, that is no small feat. You should be proud. I am, Penelope said, surprising herself with the admission, but it is exhausting sometimes, never having anyone to share the burden with. I know something about that, Hawk replied. The mountains are beautiful, but they are lonely too. There have been times, weeks at a stretch, where I do not see another human soul. You start to crave conversation, companionship, someone to witness your life and confirm that you exist. Penelope turned to look at him, this powerful man who seemed so self-sufficient, and saw the vulnerability beneath. Is that why you take scouting work? To have human contact? Partly. And partly because I am not entirely suited to solitude, despite what I tell myself. I need people, just in smaller doses than most. He rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow to meet her eyes. But I have been thinking lately that maybe what I need is not just any people, but the right person. Her heart began to race, understanding the implication but almost afraid to believe it. Hawk, I know we have only just met, he said quickly, and I know this is too soon to be speaking of such things. But Penelope, I have met a lot of people in my wandering, and I have never felt with anyone else what I felt the moment I saw you beat Crawford at that fort. It was not just admiration for your strength, though I did admire it. It was recognition, like looking across a room and seeing someone you have been searching for without knowing you were searching. Penelope sat very still, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to dismiss his words as fancy, as the romantic notions of someone caught up in the moment, but she could not, because she felt it too, that sense of rightness, of pieces fitting together that she had not known were missing. I feel it as well, she whispered, and it terrifies me. Hawk reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, his grip gentle but firm. Why does it terrify you? Because I have built my life around not needing anyone, Penelope said honestly. Around being strong enough, capable enough, sufficient unto myself. If I let myself need you and then you leave or something happens to you, I do not know if I could survive that. Life has no guarantees, Hawk said quietly. I learned that when my parents died, when I watched good men fall during the Apache Wars, when I have seen drought and disease take whole herds of cattle. But I also learned that the time we have is precious exactly because it is uncertain, and I would rather spend my days with someone who matters, even if those days are numbered, than spend a lifetime alone just to avoid the risk of loss. Penelope felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the simple truth of his words. When do you have to leave again? For your trapping? Not for another week at least. And when I do go, it would only be for a few weeks at a time. I could base myself out of this area, check my trap lines in the mountains to the north and west, but always come back here. To you, if you wanted that. I do want that, Penelope said, and felt something unlock in her chest, a tightness she had been carrying for years suddenly releasing. I want that very much. Hawk moved closer, releasing her hand only to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. May I kiss you? She answered by closing the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, exploratory, but quickly deepened into something more passionate. His arms came around her, pulling her close, and she marveled at the solid strength of him, the way she felt both protected and cherished. They broke apart finally, both breathing hard, and Hawk rested his forehead against hers. I am going to court you properly, he said firmly, with all the respect and time you deserve. But I want you to know, Penelope Zimmerman, that I am already half in love with you, and I suspect it will not be long before it is all the way. Then we are even. Penelope replied, her voice shaking with emotion, because I am halfway there myself. They spent the rest of that afternoon at the spring, talking and stealing kisses, planning a future that neither of them had dared imagine before. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they reluctantly packed up the picnic and rode back to Penelope's ranch. Hawk did not leave that evening. Instead, with all propriety observed, he bedded down in the barn, insisting that he wanted to get an early start helping her with morning chores before he headed into town. Penelope did not argue, grateful for his presence, even if they were separated by the distance between house and barn. She lay in her bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert darkness, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the scrub brush, and added to it the knowledge that Hawk was nearby, watching over her even in sleep. It was a feeling she could grow accustomed to, she realized. The relief of not being entirely alone anymore. The next week passed in a haze of happiness that Penelope had never experienced before. Hawk was at her ranch every day, helping with the heavy work, mending and building and hauling. He fixed her windmill, which had been making an ominous grinding sound for months. He reinforced her corrals with his own hands, muscles bunching and flexing beneath his shirt as he lifted posts that Penelope would have struggled with. He taught her better techniques for tracking predators that threatened her livestock, shared his knowledge of reading weather signs and finding water in arid country. But it was the small moments that Penelope treasured most. The way Hawk made coffee in the mornings, strong enough to strip paint but exactly how she liked it. The sound of his laughter when one of her chickens pecked aggressively at his boot, mistaking the leather for a threat. The comfortable silences as they worked side by side, no need to fill every moment with conversation. The evenings on her porch, watching the sunset while he told her stories of his time in the mountains, his encounters with grizzly bears and elk herds, and once, memorably, a mountain lion that had stalked him for 3 days before losing interest. They kissed often, growing bolder with each encounter, learning the taste and feel of each other. But Hawk always pulled back before things went too far, his breathing ragged, his eyes dark with want but his restraint absolute. "I will not dishonor you," he said one evening when Penelope had pressed herself against him, her hands fisted in his shirt, silently begging for more. "When we come together fully, it will be as husband and wife with all the respect and commitment that entails." "Then marry me," Penelope had said recklessly, not caring that it should be his question to ask. "Marry me, Hawk Jensen, because I love you and I cannot imagine my life without you anymore." Hawk had gone very still, his hands tightening on her waist. "You mean that?" "Truly, I have never meant anything more in my life." He had kissed her then with a desperation that matched her own, and when they broke apart he was grinning like a madman. "Then yes, Penelope Zimmerman, I will marry you. I will marry you and spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." They were wed 3 weeks later in Marfa in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling minister who happened to be passing through. Mrs. Fletcher from the boarding house stood as witness along with the fort's doctor, a kind-faced man named Patterson who had treated Penelope once for a broken finger and approved heartily of her choice in husbands. Penelope wore her mother's blue dress again, and Hawk wore new trousers and a shirt he had purchased specially for the occasion. And when the minister pronounced them man and wife, the small gathering erupted in genuine joy. They held a celebration dinner at the boarding house, Mrs. Fletcher outdoing herself with roasted venison, cornbread, greens, and 3 different pies. Some of the soldiers from Fort Davis attended, including the grizzled corporal, who had refereed the arm wrestling match that had started everything. Even Crawford showed up, somewhat sheepish, to offer gruff congratulations and admit that he had been an ass. "You are a lucky man, Jensen," he said, shaking Hawk's hand with genuine respect. "She is stronger than half the men I serve with and twice as smart." "I am aware," Hawk replied, his arm around Penelope's waist, pulling her close. "And I do not intend to waste the gift I have been given." That night they consummated their marriage in Penelope's house, which was now their house, learning each other with tender intensity. Hawk was careful with his strength, reverent in his touch, and Penelope discovered that surrender did not mean weakness when it was freely given to someone who treasured it. They loved each other until dawn painted the sky, and when Penelope woke wrapped in Hawk's arms, she felt more complete than she had ever imagined possible. The early months of their marriage were an adjustment, 2 independent people learning to share space and decisions and the mundane details of daily life. Hawk moved his belongings into Penelope's ranch, which they both agreed would be their home base. He still took trapping expeditions into the mountains, but they were shorter now, 2 or 3 weeks at most, and he always returned laden with furs and game and stories, sweeping Penelope into his arms the moment he dismounted. Penelope, for her part, had to learn to accept help without feeling that it diminished her accomplishments. Hawk never tried to take over her ranch, never made decisions without consulting her, but his presence made the work easier in ways both practical and emotional. Tasks that had taken her days now took hours with his help. Problems that had seemed insurmountable became manageable when she had someone to discuss them with. They expanded the ranch over that first year, purchasing additional cattle with the money from Hawk's fur sales, adding a new section to the barn, digging a second well. Hawk proved to have a gift for working with horses, and they began breeding them along with the cattle, selling well-trained mounts to the army and to ranchers throughout the region. Winter came, cold and harsh, and they spent long evenings by the fire, Penelope reading aloud from books while Hawk worked on mending tack or carving small wooden animals that he would occasionally give to the children in town. They made love often, exploring each other with growing confidence and creativity, and Penelope marveled at how Hawk could be both gentle and fierce, protective and playful, serious and surprisingly funny. Spring brought renewal and also news that made Penelope nervous and excited in equal measure. She was pregnant, her monthlies having stopped, her breasts tender, her stomach occasionally rebelling against foods she normally loved. When she told Hawk he had lifted her off her feet and spun her around, his face transformed with joy. "A baby," he breathed, setting her down carefully as if she might break. "Penelope, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, searching his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Hawk said, dropping to his knees and pressing his face against her still flat belly. "I am awed, humbled, terrified that I will mess it up somehow. But yes, above all, I am happy." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Penelope's strong body adapting to the changes with minimal difficulty. She continued working the ranch through her 6th month, refusing to be coddled, though she did allow Hawk to take over the heaviest tasks. By her 7th month, her belly was swollen and ungainly, making mounting a horse impossible, but she still fed the chickens, tended the garden they had planted together, and managed the household accounts. Hawk was attentive to the point of being overprotective, constantly worried that she was doing too much, bringing her cushions and footstools and insisting she rest. Penelope found it both touching and occasionally irritating, and they had more than one argument about her capabilities versus his concerns. "I am pregnant, not broken," she snapped one afternoon when he had tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know that," Hawk said, his voice tight with frustration. "But you are carrying the most precious thing in the world to me, and I will not risk losing either of you because of stubbornness." Penelope had softened at that, seeing the real fear beneath his hovering. "You will not lose us. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, and most of them survive it just fine." "Most is not all," Hawk said quietly, "and the thought of anything happening to you makes me feel like I cannot breathe." She had gone to him then, awkward with her bulk, and wrapped her arms around him as best she could. "I will be careful," she promised. "I will not take foolish risks. But you have to let me live my life, Hawk. I need to feel useful, needed for more than just the baby I am carrying." "You are needed for so much more than that," Hawk said fiercely, his arms gentle around her. "You are my partner, my best friend, the person who makes every day worth living. The baby is a blessing, but you, Penelope, you are everything." Their son was born on a cool October evening in 1879, delivered by Mrs. Fletcher, who had some experience as a midwife. With Hawk pacing furiously outside until the baby's first cry split the air, Penelope had labored for 8 hours, hard, painful work that left her exhausted and sweat-soaked. But when Mrs. Fletcher placed the squalling infant on her chest, all of that faded into insignificance. The baby was perfect, red-faced and angry at the world, with a surprisingly full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same amber as his father's. They named him Henry, after Hawk's father, and Hawk held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He is so small," Hawk whispered, awed. "How is something so small even possible?" "He will not stay small long, not with you for a father," Penelope said, her voice hoarse from screaming during the final pushes. "He will be a giant like you." And indeed, Henry grew rapidly, thriving on Penelope's milk and his parents' devotion. He was a good baby, relatively quiet, with a serious expression that made him look like a tiny old man. Hawk was a devoted father, changing soiled cloths without complaint, walking the floor at night when Henry fussed, singing off-key lullabies in a rumbling bass that somehow always soothed the baby. Penelope watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing new depths to the man she had married. He was patient and gentle, careful of his strength, and the joy in his face whenever he looked at Henry was enough to make her heart ache. They settled into a new routine that revolved around the baby while still managing the ranch. Penelope wore Henry in a sling while she worked, and as he grew older, they made a playpen for him in whatever area they were working, surrounding him with blankets and toys while they mended fences or tended livestock. The animals accepted the baby with equanimity, and Henry seemed to have no fear, reaching out chubby hands toward horses and cattle with equal enthusiasm. The ranch continued to prosper. They were now well known in the area for quality horses, and Hawk's reputation as a scout and guide brought additional income. They hired their first employee when Henry was 2, a young Mexican man named Diego who had been displaced by violence across the border and needed work. Diego proved to be a hard worker and good with the animals, and Penelope was grateful for the extra help. A second baby came when Henry was 3, a daughter this time, born with blonde hair like Penelope's and her mother's delicate features. They named her Margaret, though she was Maggie from the moment Hawk first held her, and if anything, Hawk was even more smitten with his daughter than he had been with his son. "I am going to have to beat men off with a stick when she is older," he said, gazing down at the tiny girl with a mixture of adoration and terror. "That is years away," Penelope said, amused. "Right now she just needs her father to love her and keep her safe." And Hawk did both fiercely and tenderly. He taught Henry to ride and track and shoot, but he taught Maggie the same skills when she was old enough, refusing to limit her based on her gender. "Her mother is the strongest person I know," he told anyone who questioned his methods. "If Maggie wants to be a rancher or a scout or anything else, I will not stand in her way." Penelope loved him all the more for that, for seeing their daughter as a full person with unlimited potential rather than someone to be sheltered and constrained. The years rolled on, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There was the drought of 1883 that killed half their herd and forced them to dig 3 new wells before they found water. There was the winter of 1885 when Hawk was caught in a blizzard during a trapping expedition and did not return for 6 days, leaving Penelope nearly mad with worry until he stumbled through the door, frostbitten and exhausted but alive. There was the smallpox outbreak in 1887 that killed 12 people in Marfa, including Mrs. Fletcher, and left the whole region grieving. But there were good times too. There was the year they made enough profit to build an addition to the house, giving the children their own rooms and adding a proper parlor. There was the 4th of July celebration where Henry, now 9, won the junior horse race, and Hawk had lifted him onto his shoulders in triumph. There was the Christmas when Maggie, 7 years old and gap-toothed, sang a carol in the church with such purity and passion that grown men wept. Through it all, Penelope and Hawk remained each other's anchor. They still made time for each other, stealing moments alone when the children were asleep or occupied, riding out to the spring where they had first declared their love and making love under the stars like newlyweds. They still talked for hours about the ranch, about their children, about dreams and fears and the state of the world. When Henry was 12 and Maggie was 9, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given her age and the years since her last pregnancy. This time the pregnancy was harder, her body older and less resilient. And Hawk hovered even more than he had before, constantly worried. Their third child was another son, born in the spring of 1890, and they named him James. He was smaller than Henry had been, more delicate, and for the first few weeks Penelope worried that he would not thrive. But James proved tougher than he looked, and by his first birthday he was crawling everywhere, getting into everything, keeping them all on their toes. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Henry showed an aptitude for business, keeping meticulous records and finding ways to maximize their profits. Maggie had her mother's strength and her father's way with horses, and by the time she was 14 she was breaking horses better than most grown men. James was the dreamer of the family, always with his head in a book or wandering the desert looking at plants and rocks, fascinated by the natural world. Hawk was now in his mid-40s, his hair streaked with gray, his beard more silver than brown, but he was still as strong as ever, still capable of lifting a struggling calf or working from dawn to dusk without complaint. Penelope at 41 had lines around her eyes and silver threads in her blonde hair, but she was still formidable, still capable of running the ranch with an iron will wrapped in pragmatism. They had built something remarkable together, a family and a legacy that would outlast them. The ranch now covered over 1,000 acres, running hundreds of head of cattle and dozens of horses. They employed 5 men year-round and twice that during roundups and drives. Their children were healthy and happy, each finding their own path while remaining connected to the land their parents had worked so hard to improve. On a summer evening in 1895, Penelope and Hawk sat on their porch watching the sunset, much as they had done thousands of times before. The children were inside, Henry helping James with his arithmetic while Maggie practiced on the piano they had bought her for her 16th birthday. The sound of her playing drifted through the open windows, a waltz she was learning. "Do you ever regret it?" Hawk asked suddenly, his hand finding Penelope's where it rested on the porch rail. "Regret what?" "Any of it. Marrying me." Tying yourself to this life instead of, I do not know, something easier. Penelope turned to look at him, this man who had been her partner for 17 years, the father of her children, the love of her life. His face was weathered now, lines etched deep from sun and wind and time, but his eyes were the same, that warm amber that had first caught her attention at Fort Davis all those years ago. Not for a single moment, she said firmly. This life has been hard, yes. But it has been ours, built by our hands and our choices. These children, this ranch, this love we have, it is more than I ever dreamed possible when I was alone, trying to survive one day at a time. Hawk raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. I think about that day sometimes. When you beat Crawford at arm wrestling, I had no idea when I defended you that you would become everything to me. I knew, Penelope said softly. Not consciously maybe, but some part of me recognized you. Knew that you were going to change my life. For the better, I hope. For the absolute best, Penelope confirmed, leaning over to kiss him soundly. You made me believe I could have it all. Strength and love. Independence and partnership. You never tried to diminish me or make me less than I was. How could I? Hawk replied, his voice rough with emotion. You are the most magnificent person I have ever known. All I have ever wanted is to be worthy of you. You are worthy, Penelope said, tears pricking at her eyes. You are so much more than worthy. They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Inside, Maggie finished her waltz and started another piece, and they could hear James laughing at something Henry said. The sound of their children, happy and safe, was the sweetest music Penelope could imagine. The years continued to pass, as years always do. Henry married a schoolteacher from El Paso and brought her to live on the ranch, building a house of his own on the northern section of their property. He and his wife gave Penelope and Hawk their first grandchild in 1897, a daughter they named Penelope in honor of her grandmother. Maggie, defying expectations, became a sought-after horse trainer and traveled throughout Texas and New Mexico, working with difficult horses that others had given up on. She eventually married a fellow horse trainer when she was 26, a good man who respected her skill and independence. James went to university in Austin, studying natural sciences, becoming a professor and writing papers on the geology and ecology of West Texas. He never married, preferring his solitude and his research, but he visited often, bringing his enthusiasm for the land that had shaped him. Hawk and Penelope grew old together, their bodies aging but their love never diminishing. Hawk's hair went completely white, and his knees began to bother him on cold mornings, but he still rode out every day to check on the cattle, still worked alongside his sons and grandsons during branding season. Penelope's hands became gnarled with arthritis, but she still kept the ranch accounts, still made decisions about breeding stock and water rights and all the 100 details that kept their operation running smoothly. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909 with a party that brought together family and friends from all over the region. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, along with Diego, now ranch foreman and a trusted friend, and many of the men who had worked for them over the years. The new generation of soldiers from Fort Davis sent a delegation, along with a letter from the commanding officer thanking Hawk for his years of service as a scout and guide. Even Crawford, now retired and living in Marfa, attended, shaking Hawk's hand and telling anyone who would listen about the time he had been beaten at arm wrestling by the finest woman in Texas and how it had led to the greatest love story he had ever witnessed. You two make me believe in miracles, he said, his voice thick with drink and sentiment. You started with an arm wrestling match and built an empire. If that is not proof that love conquers all, I do not know what is. Penelope, now 61 but still sharp-eyed and straight-backed, laughed at that. We built an empire with hard work and stubbornness and refusing to give up when things got difficult. Love helped, certainly, but it was not magic. It was choice. Every single day choosing each other in this life. The best choice I ever made, Hawk added, his arm around her waist, his eyes on her face, with the same adoration he had shown 30 years before. That night after the guests had left and the house was quiet, they lay in bed together, bodies pressed close despite the summer heat. Hawk traced patterns on Penelope's arm, his touch feather-light. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For beating Crawford that day, for agreeing to have supper with me, for taking a chance on a mountain man who had nothing to offer but his heart and his strong back. Penelope rolled to face him, her hand cupping his weathered face. You offered me everything. Partnership, respect, a love that has sustained me through every hardship and magnified every joy. I am the one who should be thanking you." "Then we are even," Hawk said, kissing her forehead. "And we are blessed beyond measure." They made love that night, slow and tender, bodies that knew each other as well as they knew themselves, moving together in practiced harmony. It was different from the passion of their youth, gentler and deeper, built on decades of intimacy and trust. When they finished, they lay tangled together, and Penelope felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. The final years of their life together were peaceful. They gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Henry and his sons, content to advise rather than direct, to enjoy the fruits of their labor rather than constantly striving for more. They took long rides together when Hawk's knees permitted, returning to the spring where they had first confessed their love, marveling that the cottonwoods seemed unchanged while they had grown so old. Hawk died first in the spring of 1915 at the age of 68. He went peacefully in his sleep, Penelope beside him, his hand clasped in hers. One moment he was breathing, deep and steady, and the next he was gone, slipping away between one heartbeat and the next. Penelope had felt the moment he left, felt the absence of him like a physical wound, and she had wept over his body until their children came to comfort her. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple granite marker that read, "Hawkins Jensen, beloved husband, father, and friend." The entire community turned out for the funeral, a testament to the respect and affection people had for the quiet mountain man who had built a life of honor and integrity. Penelope mourned him deeply, the loss of her partner leaving a hole that nothing could fill. But she did not break. She was still needed, still had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved her, still had a ranch to oversee even if she was no longer doing the physical work. She lived for another 7 years, her mind sharp even as her body failed, and she spent those years telling stories about Hawk, making sure that future generations would know the kind of man he had been. She died in her sleep at the age of 80, on a cold January night in 1922, exactly 43 years to the day after the birth of their first son. Her children found her in the morning, lying peacefully in the bed she had shared with Hawk for over 30 years. A slight smile on her face, as if she had seen something wonderful in her final moments. They buried her beside Hawk on the hill, and at the funeral, Henry, now an old man himself, told the story of how his parents had met. He spoke of the arm wrestling match, of the supper at the boarding house, of a love that had been instantaneous and undeniable, and had lasted through hardship and joy until death finally parted them. They were extraordinary people, Henry said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of family and friends. Not because they did anything famous or grand, but because they built something lasting through hard work and unwavering commitment to each other and to the land they loved. They showed us what it means to be partners, to face life's challenges together, to build a legacy that will outlast us all. And indeed, their legacy did last. The ranch they had built together continued to thrive, passed down through the generations, growing and adapting with the times but never losing the core values Penelope and Hawk had instilled. Their descendants spread throughout Texas and beyond, carrying with them the story of the woman who beat a cavalry sergeant at arm wrestling, and the mountain man who bought her supper, and how that chance encounter had blossomed into one of the great love stories of the West. In the small museum that Marfa eventually established, there is a photograph of Penelope and Hawk, taken on their 25th wedding anniversary. Hawk stands behind Penelope, his hands on her shoulders, his height and breadth making her look almost delicate, despite her formidable presence. She sits straight-backed and serious, but if you look closely, you can see the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth, and Hawk's expression is one of unmistakable pride and love. The caption beneath reads simply, "Penelope and Hawkins Jensen, pioneers and partners who built their empire on love and hard work." And sometimes on quiet evenings, when the wind blows just right across the Texas desert, people swear they can hear laughter drifting from the old spring near the Jensen Ranch, and see two figures sitting together beneath the cottonwoods, holding hands and watching the sunset, just as they had done for all those years when they walked the earth together. Whether it is memory or something more, it serves as a reminder that some loves are powerful enough to echo through time, leaving their mark on the land and the people who come after. The ranch still stands, over a century after Penelope first inherited it from her father, now operated by her great-great-great-grandchildren, who know the story by heart and tell it to their own children. They know about the arm wrestling match, about the mountain man with muscles like granite and a heart soft enough to recognize kindness when he saw it. They know about the woman strong enough to survive alone, but wise enough to accept partnership when it was offered. They know about the love that started with a supper and lasted beyond death. And in Fort Davis, now a historical site rather than an active military post, there is a plaque that commemorates the famous arm wrestling match of 1878, when a young woman named Penelope Zimmerman proved her strength and inadvertently began one of the most enduring love stories in Texas history. Tourists photograph it, curious about the details, and the park rangers tell the story with evident pleasure, pointing out that this was a time when women were not supposed to be strong or independent, when conventional wisdom said they needed protection and guidance. But Penelope had refused those limitations, and Hawk had loved her not despite her strength but because of it. It is a story that resonates even now, in an age so different from the one they lived in. Because at its core, it is not just about the Wild West or frontier life, or even the specifics of their individual journey. It is about two people who found each other against the odds, who chose each other every day, who built something beautiful and lasting through their commitment and love. It is about strength that does not preclude tenderness, about independence that does not exclude partnership, about a love that was both fierce and gentle, passionate and enduring. The spring where they used to picnic still bubbles up from between the rocks. The cottonwoods still provide shade, and if you sit there quietly on a summer evening, you can almost feel their presence, the echo of all those conversations and kisses and shared dreams. The land remembers them, holds their story in the rocks and the soil and the water that sustained them. And as long as there are people who value love and commitment and the courage to build a life on your own terms, Penelope and Hawk's story will continue to be told, a testament to the power of choosing each other and never letting go. Their great-great-great-grandson, also named Hawkins, now runs the ranch with his wife, and they have made their own mark on the land while honoring the traditions established so long ago. They raise cattle and horses, just as their ancestors did, but also welcome visitors who want to experience authentic ranch life, to understand what it meant to carve a home out of harsh land through sheer determination. They tell the story of Penelope and Hawk to these visitors, and invariably people are moved, seeing in that long-ago couple something universal and timeless. Love, real love, the kind that lasts, is not about grand gestures or perfect moments. It is about showing up every day, about choosing partnership even when it is difficult, about respecting the person you are with enough to let them be fully themselves. Penelope and Hawk understood that instinctively, built their entire relationship on that foundation, and because of it, they created something that has lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. On the ranch, in the main house that has been expanded and modernized, but still contains the original rooms that Penelope and Hawk occupied, there is a framed newspaper clipping from 1909. It is the article that ran in the El Paso newspaper about their 30th anniversary celebration, and it includes interviews with both of them. Penelope's quote, printed in careful type that has faded with age, reads, "People ask me what the secret to a lasting marriage is, and I tell them there is no secret. It is choice. Every day choosing kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, partnership over dominance. It is work, hard work, but it is the best work I have ever done." Hawk's quote, printed just below, is simpler but no less profound. "I loved her the moment I saw her beat a man who thought she was weak. I love her still, more than I did then, because she has shown me every day since what true strength looks like. She is my partner, my equal, and the best decision I ever made was asking her to share my life." Those words, spoken over a century ago, still resonate. Still remind people that the best relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Still inspire couples to choose each other deliberately and consistently. And so the story lives on, passed from generation to generation, refined and embellished in small ways but never losing its essential truth. The woman who beat a cavalry sergeant at arm wrestling, the mountain man who bought her supper. The love that grew from that chance encounter into something eternal. It is a story of the Wild West, yes, but more than that, it is a story of the human heart and its capacity for devotion, for commitment, for building something beautiful out of the raw materials of courage and hope. In the end, that is what makes their story worth remembering. Not the specific details of their time or place, though those are important. Not even the remarkable nature of their achievements, building a thriving ranch from almost nothing. What makes their story timeless is the love at its center, A love that was tested by hardship and time and loss, but never broke, never faltered, never dimmed. A love that transformed two solitary people into partners, that created a family and a legacy, that left the world better than it found it. Penelope and Hawk would likely be bemused by the attention their story has received over the years, by the way it has been preserved and passed down. They were at heart practical people who did what needed to be done without expecting recognition or reward. But they would also perhaps be pleased to know that their love mattered, that it inspired others, that it served as proof that the best things in life are worth fighting for and worth cherishing. Their story, which began with an arm wrestling match and a simple supper, which grew through years of partnership and devotion, which ended only when death parted them, and perhaps not even then, remains a beacon. It reminds us that love is not weakness but the greatest strength, that choosing the right partner and honoring that choice every day can create something that transcends individual lives, that the legacy we leave is not measured in wealth or fame, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. And somewhere perhaps, in whatever comes after this life, Penelope and Hawk are together still, holding hands and watching sunsets, laughing over shared memories, secure in the knowledge that they chose well and loved deeply and left behind something worth remembering. Their story, born in the dust and heat of West Texas in 1878, continues to echo through the generations, a testament to the enduring power of love freely given and faithfully kept. A reminder that the best stories are the ones that end not with an ending, but with a beginning that never truly stops.